And on that note, hi everybody. Welcome to our Bluebeard deep dive. Could we all introduce ourselves? And Nicole, let's start with you.
Hi, I am Nicole Cowan. I am the assistant librarian of the Omaha Symphony.
Serena.
Hi, my name is Serena Royton, and I'm the assistant conductor of the Omaha Symphony.
And Matt.
I'm Matt Fuerst. I'm a composer and I write the program notes for the Omaha Symphony.
We got to get you a title, Matt, the assistant something. And then that way it's just like uniform across the board. Hi, everyone. Welcome to OSA Backstage. I'm Dani Meyer. That was Sauce. And on today's episode, we begin our deep dive into Bluebeard's Castle by Béla Bartók. Guys, we have so much fun stuff coming out over the next week and a half that is all Bluebeard related, and I think you will understand exactly why the moment this episode starts. We have an opera in conversation, which I'm super excited about. We're actually recording that tonight. We have an interview with conductor Lydia Yankovskaya. April is all about Bluebeard for good reason, and I just want to say, when you get to talk to smart people about fun things, that's the best job in the world. Enjoy. Welcome, guys. Thank you so much for doing this. I want to try something a little bit different than we did last time. And I want to ask each of you what comes to mind when I just say the words Bluebeard's Castle. Matt?
Door number 5. In that fantastic moment.
Okay, should we put a pin in that? Or do you want to talk further? Okay, so door number 5. Yeah. Serena?
A dark, gloomy, opera film.
Yeah. And Nicole?
I would also go with dark and introspective, and gosh, psychosis is really getting popular here.
We're doing a real intense deep dive into both Bluebeard and then via Bluebeard Bartók himself, right? Which leads me to my next question. What about Bartók? Like, am I right in assuming that maybe all of us had our first experience with this piece in a college classroom somewhere? Is that potentially accurate to say, or does someone have Nicole? Okay, go for it.
I didn't really know this piece all that well. I know more like percussion and celesta, or strings, percussion, and celeste. And I know Bartók a little bit more like the last section of his life more. So Bluebeard comes before that period. So I knew about Bartók a little bit more obliquely, and like Bluebeard's Castle I've heard of, but before like really deep diving into this, I just knew the title of the opera.
So will this be your first experience with it live, or have you gotten to hear it and experience it live yet?
This will be my first experience live.
That's awesome. Okay, Matt, how about you?
I came across a CD when I was a teenager and bought it just because at this point I loved Bartók's music. I was a pianist, so I loved his piano concerti. I loved his solo piano works. So I was really kind of curious about this. So I bought it and kind of fell in love with it immediately. And unfortunately, I have not had a chance to hear it live, which I am very envious of all of you that get to hear it live or perform it. It's such a spectacular work.
You're going to have to come down to Omaha, Matt. There's no hope for it. Okay, so you bought the CD. Do you remember, was it just the Bartók name that drew you in? Okay.
Yeah, I was like, this is a piece I don't know. Okay, I'll buy this and check it out. It was in like the $2 bin, which also helped. But that's why I bought. Yeah, I bought as a teenager.
You cannot that's really appropriate for a teenage. If you're going for your goth dark phase, Bluebeard's Castle is a solid choice from the bargain bin. All right, Serena, where did you first encounter Bluebeard?
Someone else basically sat me down. It was like, we are watching this opera movie film. a little bit against my will. It's like, oh, well, I don't know if, this doesn't really sound, even the plot was not very interesting to me. I'm someone who normally enjoys comedies kind of person. Like I didn't really have a dark emo phase that I really wanted to revisit or anything. So that's why like, my first memory is being sat down and like sitting through this. I've never seen it live. But the more I look at this music and like learn it and study it, the more interesting it becomes, because my first experience of Bartók was in the classroom, but it was more about how Bartók influenced ethnomusicology and all of his folk music, his interest in that, his how he influenced recording, and how his early recording, influenced how we develop those things. And it's very, very different, I feel like, than the Bartók that wrote this particular piece. And the more I learn about it, the more it all kind of comes together and gives me an appreciation that I did not have when I just watched it as a film with no context whatsoever.
I also think that's fair, because we think, okay, you say the word opera. And for me, what comes to mind was the very first opera I ever saw, which was Don Giovanni. And it's chaotic, it's multiple scenes, it's costumes, it's very extroverted. Every character is telling you exactly how they feel all the time. They're singing extensive arias about it. And in this case, everything, it's almost as if Bartók, even from the very beginning, he essentially sets it up. It's like, is it real? Is it not real? Everything that you take away from this, you will have to decide for yourself as the viewer. And I think that really does not align with traditional opera. And it's a really cool experiment. So Nicole, going back to you for like when you said you knew a different aspect of Bartók, can you talk about kind of what Serena was saying, but like how you knew Bartók as a composer and then going into this direction?
Sure. So I did a project at the end of my master's degree where I put together a like full case of Bartók paraphernalia, for lack of a better word, of what we had at Indiana University, really centering on Bartók's life in America. So the last about 4-ish years of his life, which 1941 to 1945. And you really focusing on, because he did visit Indiana briefly. And like, that was a really cool deep dive. I knew truly nothing about Bartók before this. And my practicum teacher was like, hey, like, let's work with the musicology department. There's an event that they're putting on for Bartók, especially centered around his work with folk music. Like, can you put together a case with Indiana stuff about Bartók? And so then I was like, okay, start from the beginning, figure out who this guy is. We had a lot of really cool things. I ended up through the project finding like old newspaper clippings of like a symposium, or not symposium, but like a lecture that he did at Indiana in like 1943. Don't quote me on that year, but I'm pretty close. I also wrote an article on it. I'm pretty proud of that whole project. But what I knew about him was a lot of, by the end of his life, or I guess throughout his life, he was a very quiet, reserved man who was sick all the time. He ended up passing away from what they now know as leukemia. But he struggled with health issues his whole life. It got a lot worse once he moved to the US. But he was this very quiet, reserved man, except like kind of the more public persona of him. But like, he was also a very spicy guy. There is a piece of, I guess, an advertisement that he has pulled out of a magazine or something. And he's like, he writes, oh, there's not enough not enough paper to write music on, but there's enough to print this cigarette ad. So like, he has spicy takes, and is very like, he knows exactly what he wants, is kind of the way that I picture him, but he's also this quiet, reserved guy to kind of everyone else. Anyway, tangent. So, my knowledge of Bartók is both as a composer, as someone who like, a lot of what I found was a lot of his like lecture and recital tours where he's really talking about folk music and like how he discovered it, how he like, important things to know about it, because kind of both like during his lifetime, like that was going back and studying the music of like what they called peasant music was, not super popular. Not a lot of people were doing it. It, became sort of like what ethnomusicology would eventually become. But really trying to bring about this music that was, relatively unknown. So that's kind of where I see Bartók, is especially that folk and ethnomusicology vein. So then kind of working backwards to like, this is a lot earlier in his life than where I was kind of studying and learning. This is kind of at the beginning of his like really mature period. He's really getting good at incorporating a lot of this folk music into his music. He had gone on 3 different tours, I think, by that point, 1906, 07, and then 1718. And this opera was written in 1918. So like really he's starting to get into that both folk music, like he's been writing with using folk music and folk melodies for a good long while, but then also really moving towards that kind of expressionist phase and pushing a little bit towards atonality, but through folk music, which is, I think, is a really interesting angle that, going back to this period and then knowing kind of what he would go on to make was a fun kind of bridging gap.
That's interesting. So because you knew better what he was going to become, looking at earlier works is like seeing the seedlings that are going to become future Bartók. And then Matt, you kind of have the exact opposite experience where you're as a pianist, like what period of Bartók would you say you were most familiar with before you found Bluebeard's Castle? Oh, Matt, your audio's...
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Sorry. Maybe I shouldn't mute myself. Probably the music from the mid 1920s, late 1920s on. So everything from, the piano sonata out of doors suite, the 3 piano concerti, the late quartets, concerto orchestra, those pieces I knew really, really well. And what Nicole talked about with Bluebeard's Castle, I kind of have the same experience. It's really fascinating going through the score and just kind of seeing what he's doing now, but also being able to see what he, the seeds, like she said, of what he will do later on in his career as well. So would any of you say that you were familiar with Bartók, his work before this point in his life? Okay, interesting. So because this was especially fascinating because he was simultaneously, like, he was trying to win competitions with this one, and so there's a feeling of putting quite a lot of heart and passion into a project that would ultimately become his one and only opera. And so I wonder if we could, knowing later Bartók, does this feel like, how to phrase this? Does this feel like something that once he had it out of his system, he was therefore free to move on to other styles of projects? Or do you feel like this was just what he needed to do at the time? I want to go back and talk about the setup for this opera a little bit, but
I mean, from what I kind of understand about Bartók, he had a lot of different passions that all, like, at certain times of his life became more important or less important. So he was a pianist, he was a performer. At times he was quite successful in that, and at other times he was not finding a lot of success in that. He was at times, really prolific as a composer, and then at other times really prolific as, really trying to study folk music. I think from what I understand, folk music kind of was his, like, really his passion, but it didn't always, like, just the time in which he was living was incredibly turbulent. He's living through both world wars. And there are times where I remember seeing research about, like, he had a tour planned and then it had to be canceled because either the Hungarian government wasn't sponsoring it, or what was, what we'd know. And other times, there was active conflict happening, so he wasn't able to go travel, or he got sick. So like, it seems like he wanted really to study and understand folk music. He was constantly working on trying to form like compendiums and like go back and like have a database. Obviously this is before databases, but still trying to work on this stuff, and money, all these just like conflicting things. So I the way that I see it is it kind of just depended on his circumstances, where he was, pushing forward and where he was pulling back on his different interests. But folk music was always the thing that he was trying to work on.
Matt, does that feel?
I think so. Yeah. I'm still kind of thinking about your question. I think, I don't know, to me, what I found really kind of fascinating, and I don't know if this actually answers your question or not, but as Nicole was sort of saying, you can start to see in this piece, the combination of the use of like pentatonic scales they found in the folk music, along with some of the more asymmetric meters that he found in some of the dance music from these villages that were very different from what Liszt considered to be Hungarian folk music. Simultaneous to that, you do see, like Nicole was saying, the incorporation of more 20th century harmonic, ideas and things like this. I think what's interesting about this piece to me is you can also see a heavy influence of two composers that meant a lot to him early on in his life, Strauss and Debussy, or at least I think one can. Whether it's the use of the blood motif, this minor second, this shrill, dissonant sound that to me, always makes me think of Salome, where Strauss uses the exact same motif for Salome whenever she asks for the head of John the Baptist. And similarly, Debussy, whether it's, some of the harmonic things that he does, the use of the pentatonic scale, or even the opera itself, the kind of similarities with the symbolist world of Pelléas and Melisande, Debussy's only opera. I think there's also kind of similarities there that I think you simultaneously, it almost seems like this middle period where you can see where he's coming from, see where he's about to go to, even the arch form that this opera has. We see later on in the fifth string quartet, the second piano concerto, the concerto for orchestra. So it's to me, it's a really fascinating work that is, again, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question here, but I was kind of thinking about what you were asking. I don't know if it necessarily moves away from anything, but you can really see almost like a bridge getting into the next stage of his development. I don't know if that answered.
I think that's great. I honestly, as I was asking it, I was like, I don't think this is going to make any sense in the English language. But yeah, so that makes sense to me that it functions as a bridge between the origins of his work and then what would become of his work. Serena, as you're studying the score and you're looking everything over, familiarity with other scores by Bartók, does this feel like you're living in a sound world that you recognize, or do you feel like you have to approach it differently as you're studying?
I think one of the biggest things that is very obvious in looking at the score is that folk influence, and I think I was reading somewhere else, they called it parlando rubato or rubato parlando, and it's this kind of sense that the music is flowing with the Hungarian text in the same way that Hungarian folk music would feel in certain strange meters or would be kind of presented in a way that flows with the text rather than in some kind of strict 4x4 time or something kind of it's just something more fluid that really goes with the text. So there's kind of this sense of, we have the English translation underneath, but it's almost like it can't be sung in anything other than Hungarian, because that would impede the flow of the music, the flow of not just the vocal line, but truly all parts of the music. There's a lot of ebb and flow to the music, a lot of then like punctuated moments in the orchestration that again highlight certain parts of the text, like when they're exclaims. So there's a lot of drama, but it's not kind of in this same strict same other operatic sense. It's like he's approaching this with all of his interests, like harmonies from folk music, the way folk music uses text and uses music with text, all seems to kind of come out in the opera.
That's super cool. Nicole, you were nodding a lot.
Yeah, I found similar stuff that Serena is talking about. Like one article that I was reading that was saying, like this text and this music exists the way it does because the language is the way that it is. It like the two could not exist without the other. And it's a really highly like stylized and specific sound in both in a very small scale form and a very large scale form. That just like everything seems so specific. Something that I also thought of while Matt was talking is like, it is this bridge. If the kind of founding of this opera is he, submitted this for a competition in 1911, and then it didn't receive a premiere until 1918 after the success of his ballet. And so, he goes back and he adds in a lot. He makes a decent amount of changes between the 1911 version and then the version that we hear, adding xylophone and celeste, which is, he adds celeste in the ballet as well, but it's not seen in his music beforehand. It's clearly that, he saw his music. The word the article was using was fatalistic. But like he was constantly a little bit unhappy with his music. And so, which like, I think a lot of people, we all feel that imposter syndrome, it has always existed. It's never going to go away. But, like he is constantly working on it and he's really, really specific. The text has a lot of stage instructions. There's a lot of musical like richness, and you have like, it all exists because of the language and because of, the story. And it's all this really, it's a full story that takes a lot of work and a lot of effort to like dig into to pull all of it out. Yeah.
I love that so much, especially because, like we actually, Serena, we're just having this conversation a couple weeks ago about what, when you're working on opera, if the conductor's not familiar with the language, even just quote unquote normal opera where it's German or Italian or French, if you're not familiar with the language, then how are you going to communicate the lines properly? How are you going to communicate like how even the singer should be approaching something? You yourself need to understand both what they're saying and how they should be saying it, and then how the composer has approached the musical line so that they can like communicate it most effectively. And then we have this added bonus of, Bartók is writing in a language that is probably completely out of the norm for most opera companies to tackle. And he's being very unapologetic about it. And so, Matt, I'm curious if from your perspective as a pianist playing Bartók, does that unapologetic nature, does that translate over to his other works, or does that feel kind of new?
No, I think, in talking about the language, I think one of the distinctive characteristics of Bartók's that one can find in a lot of his work is the sort of, the kind of quick note accent on a strong beat. For example, there's a horn call that, I'm not going to sing. I sound like Kermit the Frog with a head cold when I do. But it has like a 16th note, and then it goes down to an A, to a fourth. But that D-dum, that kind of accent is very, that rhythm is very distinctive with like, I guess, a lot of Hungarian, the Hungarian language, Béla Bartók, for example. So we see that approach to rhythm in his piano works, even if that answers your question. Hopefully that did.
Yeah. So we are tracking his adaptation of his folk music throughout all of his works. We're tracking his unapologetic, like running his language through how even he approaches his composition. Nicole, but this is let's go back. Let's or Nicole or anybody who wants to answer, this is not a Hungarian myth that he's drawing from. Who wants to like start the legend of Bluebeard? What is the legend of Bluebeard? Or actually, what do we think the legend of Bluebeard is? Because I can start. Or Serena, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, I like a little side tangent I want to add is the specific edition that we're using, which I'm sure Nicole can also speak to as the assistant librarian, just because it is, it's a really fascinating thing. It's an edition, a critical edition edited by Peter Bartók, which is Béla Bartók's youngest son, so his second son. And who spent a lot of his life dedicated to revising and editing Béla Bartók's music, his father's music. And he wrote a preface, I should say, at the beginning of the score. So I'd love to actually hear Dani, that version, and then I'd love to express what Peter very explicitly presents as his interpretation of the story and of his father's music, if that's interesting.
Yes, I think that would be amazing. So, okay, do we have the preface nearby? Do you have it nearby? Yes. Okay. So I'll start off with what I know to be the legend of Bluebeard is a very unfortunate story that comes out of France. It's actually a contemporary of Joan of Arc, who fought with her actually during her campaigns, also was apparently a murderer of women and children. And so he had a castle, and whether they were servants, whether he lured them onto the property, the legend is that he essentially murdered so many people that he was like hiding them and stuffing them in various places around the castle. And it was completely horrifying that he just became larger than life after the fact and known as Duke Bluebeard. So that's where I first heard of Bluebeard.
So then we have the libretto of the opera, which is essentially, it starts with a bard who will kind of set up the scene, which we can talk about as well. But it only it presents the entire story as a dialogue between two characters, Judith, his fourth wife at that point, and the Duke Bluebeard. And they essentially are entering Duke Bluebeard's castle, and there are 7 doors. And as they go on, Judith is asking Bluebeard to open each one of those doors. After every single one, she wants to keep going. There's some resistance, but he opens them. He really puts his foot down at some point, and but eventually relents. At the very end, at the very last door, she sees what seems like the previous 3 wives come out. We don't really know if they're in a ghost form. We don't know if it's the remains that she sees. And then at the very end, she follows those wives, or she goes behind the door. So it's all kind of vague enough that you're not really sure what's real and what's not. And the bard presents that at the very beginning with how he presents it to the audience, saying, you should consider if this is real or not. But I loved just the very first line even that Peter wrote in the preface about the story, which is, it is tempting, but would be a mistake to treat this opera as one about the legendary wicked man who killed his wives. Except for the title and framework, resemblance to the legendary figure ends. So he's quite convinced that it's just a framework for something else. He says, the clue to the story's symbolic nature is given in the bard's prologue, an essential element in the opera giving us the hint that we should look for the meaning of the story. rather than what is on the stage in front of us. We should examine the stage within us in our own lives. So I think he's quite explicit in saying it is a representation of something internal. Love to hear what you guys, your thoughts on all that. But it's quite interesting, and that it comes from this fairy tale. We go from gruesome, like this guy definitely murdered people, to how do we turn this into a story with symbolism, what each door represents, what that means, different internal struggles, and then how Bartók might be representing that in his music as well.
Yeah, that's a very he's like, this is what it's about, and I think that's so fascinating. I did find a book, and I didn't read all of it, but that was tracing the Bluebeard myth all the way from the beginning to post this opera. And so it starts out as this guy definitely murders his wives. And in at least the original version that was written by Charles Perrault, the wife that we're centered around, her name is Anne. She escapes. Her family comes and basically rescues her and kills Bluebeard. And she escapes. I also saw some reading that Melisande is the escaped, one of Bluebeard's escaped wives, which is another interesting thing. But so yeah, we see this, this story where it's definitely murder, to eventually, it gets really popular in Victorian times. It gets translated to English in 1729. And so they really get very interested in it. It also at times takes on a discussion of gender or sex, and how the different viewing of how a woman is maybe entering into the domain of man, and she wants to, discover and learn everything about him. And some people say once she learns everything, then she's uninterested, and that's a problem. Some people are she wants him to bear his entire soul to her. I mean, that's very important, but that's also very scary. Let's see. I'm just trying to make sure there's any other ones that I wanted to point out. Let's see. I think it's really interesting that this opera, it goes from, the story that Perrault publishes is, there's a lot of characters going on. It's mostly these two, and it's mostly the wife who's going through this. Bluebeard is barely all that mentioned, versus in this, it is a tete-a-tete between two characters. There's, the prologue that's interesting, or that's another outside figure, but otherwise it is just the two people, and happening on stage is just a tour de force of just two singers. So that's fascinating to me. And it's absolutely saying, I agree with Peter in the sense of it's not the same. It's taking an idea, a story, a folk story, and then incorporating it into, a piece of music, which I think that's Bartók's biggest skill, is taking folk music that he's learned and incorporating it into classical music. Yeah.
Matt, how about you? So you're a teenager, you're a goth teen, you've picked up your bargain bin Bluebeard, you're turning it on for the first time. Was this your first encounter with the Bluebeard myth along with the piece?
Yeah, I didn't know anything about the Bluebeard myth. And in fact, I have to admit that I, until really doing more background look at this, I didn't actually realize that there was a real person. So that was something that was I found very, very interesting. And it is going back to what Peter Bartók talks about. In some of the books I've been reading with this as well, I find interesting reading a variety of different people's, like what Nicole was saying, interpretations of, what does Bluebeard represent? What does, Judith represent? One of which I read even suggested that Bluebeard was Bartók himself. He was so reserved that this was why this story resonated with him. Apparently, the person that wrote the libretto originally wrote it for Kodály, Bartók's close friend and the person that Bartók went out to do his ethnomusicological work with. But I guess Kodály didn't connect with the story at all, which is then Bartók looked at it and really resonated with him. And so I've even seen some interpretations of Bluebeard representing Bartók himself as a really reserved human being, really closed off. So it is really fascinating, just the symbolic elements of this and the variety of different ways one can interpret what this opera is about.
And
sorry,
go ahead.
A super quick tangent. I think it is really a little bit creepy that Bartók dedicates this opera to his first wife, who he then leaves for his student Dita. So I don't know. It's kind of giving, Symphony Fantastique, and it being written for this woman who's like, maybe I don't want to be associated with this specific piece of work. So I don't know. I found that really like, oh, that's odd.
Even if you don't take it literally, even if you follow Peter's advice, you follow the bard's advice, and you're, I'm really looking forward to talking with our conductor Lydia Yankovskaya about this, because I want to get her direction for where she's taking this. But if you're thinking of this more as an introspection of man and woman who've decided they've decided to get married, but in order for this marriage to actually be real, he has to reveal more and more of himself and hope that she's comfortable with it. And then by the time he's revealed everything, it's too late. It's quote unquote too late for her. Even if you take that aspect, there is still a horror aspect that Bartók is super explicit about. And Matt, you started it by mentioning the blood motif, which I think we should talk about. And even there are moments of supreme beauty and just like overwhelming, like gorgeousness. Door number 5 being, I think, my chief example of that. And even that is ruined by this spectral, horrifying, blood-covered, expressly blood-covered thing that Bartók puts throughout. Can you talk a little bit about the blood motif?
Yeah, it's again, one of the great things about this motif is it's so easy to pick up on. Can you hear me okay? Or okay. It's so easy to pick up on. Again, it'll always be in the upper winds or the upper instruments. It'll be extremely shrill. It'll with the potential, especially if someone's not accustomed to some 20th century music, it could make the hair on your hair stand up. It really, truly is horrifying. And it appears in virtually every door except the 6th. I don't think it appears in the 6th, the Lake of Tears. But instead what Bartók does is have this really eerie kind of gesture that to me sounds like ripples. I think even foreshadows a bit of the night music that he'll write later on, where his night music is not like Chopin's nocturnes, but more, the critters of the night and things like that. Not like Dracula, but I mean, crickets and the like. Yeah.
I think Dracula has a really good place in Bluebeard's castle, and I'm not going to discount him. So carry on.
But it's in most of these cases, with the exception of like the first door, it immediately hits you. Like it is there. You get little hints of it as Judith is kind of trying to feel her way around this darkened castle. She says something along the lines of like the walls are crying, but you hear the blood motif, which is him telling you what she's actually feeling, which is one of my favorite moments. It's just such a horrifying and grotesque musical moment, and just within the story. But when she opens that first door and sees the torture chamber, you really the listener will get that front and center. And it's almost nonstop. So, yeah, as you said, with each door that kind of opens, it can start off very beautiful, and then you start to see it again. I think it's door number 4, the garden. It's some of the most beautiful music in the opera, but then when she notices the blood on the flowers, that comes back again, and it just every one of these doors just eventually gets twisted, whether it's that one or just the door number 5, which to me is just one of the most magnificent moments in all music. It just is overwhelming in its power and brightness, and even then with the clouds, you start to get a little bit of that as well. So
yeah, I think it's it's so fascinating, and maybe we'll get to this in a second, but like how it tries to change as Bluebeard tries to kind of recontextualize the motif as like, oh, it's the sun, it's beautiful, and like, but now Judith knows the truth, or at least knows part of the truth, that like no matter what, like she's starting to see the horror, she's starting to feel the horror. I think it's so well done, of like he is showing off at door 5 the grand beautiful castle, and the music is so stately and a fanfare, and then it like multiple times cuts back to Judith singing completely by herself just this same line that I'm now forgetting. Oh, your domain is endless. And it's like this, but it's not in awe. It's absolutely in sheer terror as she realizes, like she's starting to realize, oh God, even these things that are so beautiful are also tainted by the blood. And that music is just, that absolute ringing is just there the whole time.
Okay, so I want to talk about this. I agree that juxtaposition is one of the most stunning things in the entire opera, especially the almost the flatness of her voice. This just very small, when she's been so powerful throughout, she's been just as powerful as Bluebeard. I am so curious about what we feel about Judith, because a lot of his direction is Bluebeard tries to stop her, or he says no, and she tries to, she's coaxing, persuading, forcing, yelling, like she at every point. I think there's only like 1 or 2 doors where he's like, oh yeah, open this one. Like I think door number 5, he's like, oh, she's gonna love this, like open this door. Everything else he's like, please don't make me, don't ask me to. How do we feel about Judith then in this context of she's terrified? You could argue that she has done this to herself.
It's so funny, actually, that moment at door number 5, the way I've always interpreted it is actually more of just the in awe. To me, I didn't hear the terror yet. I feel like that happens as she starts to make the realization of who Bluebeard is at door 6. So it's interesting. My interpretation of it was more just from the awe. But yeah, I find now it's making me rethink that. But I think that's one of the beautiful thing about this opera too, though, is that I think it answers kind of like with Judith and who she is and stuff. I think it all is dependent on how you interpret everything else, which makes this just endlessly fascinating, I think.
Yeah, I'm definitely swayed by the Jesse Norman version, which I was so sad when I first was starting to look into watching the opera, because I really just wanted to get a kind of full scale view of it. That version's in English, and I was just like, okay, I'm gonna go watch the version that's in Hungarian first, because truly, again, like I said, like we've all said, the language is super important. But then going back and just kind of watching specific scenes of that one, like the terror that, like, she definitely puts the terror a lot earlier than other versions. So like, I think, again, every interpretation is a little bit different, and that's seemingly the point, because we're all, this is a very psychological, what's real, what's not, what's, we don't know how Bluebeard is kind of feeling at times. Like, there's not a lot of instruction. There's a lot of the stagings you watch, you can't tell if he's scared, if he's mad, whatever, what have you. And I think to the question about, like, is this Judith's fault? I think, how much of this that we're seeing is real, in the sense of, like, is he actually torturing people? Is he actually murdering his wives? Or is it more a thought of, like, if you love someone fully, you want to love all of them, including their darker parts, more jagged things. And I guess my interpretation of it is maybe she was expecting what, most people, I think, would expect about, like, loving an all of a person. They're probably not a murderer, but some of them probably are. And so I think it's driven by this, like, incessant need to know, and to know all of a person, and born out of a desire of love. And yeah, I don't know if I fully have a completely thought about that, but I think like, yes, it's maybe a prison of her own making. He tells her many times, like, why did you come here? You didn't have to come here. But also like she wants to love this person, and all that person entails, even if they're a murderer. Oops.
Serena?
Yeah, I absolutely agree. It's coming from this place of, well, I want to know these deep, dark parts of you that you want to keep hidden from the world. But, I'm here. I want to bring light to those areas. I want to show you that all those things are okay. I interpret a lot of the blood kind of being in every room to kind of be like the way he was hurt in the past and the kind of conflict and the wounds he might have had, and just kind of how difficult those things were for him. But there might also be a kind of message of, where's the line? And the seventh door was kind of the line where maybe there are certain things that you don't share with people because ultimately they will hurt someone beyond repair, and kind of the sense of like, she has to join them. It's almost like he crossed the line again. And she, like the other wives, decided that it was too much. It was too hurtful to find out whatever it was. And then left, and he was back in darkness. I think I saw another interpretation of just kind of her naivete in terms of her pushing and then not really being able to accept the wives that he loved before, which, she is the wife of Night, I guess, and he had all these wives before in different parts of his life. You could kind of interpret it as, and just not being able to accept that these wives make up who he is as a whole person, and that she, kind of has to accept him as he is with all of that history. And the fact that she's unable to also proves her kind of naivete and just the constant pushing she does throughout the story. But I do kind of see it like this kind of very relational, and then it being a little applicable to everyone, knowing, the kind of how difficult it is to be vulnerable, what certain vulnerabilities represent for people, kind of maybe past hurts and things like that. And then perhaps, is there a line ever where can you really show someone everything about yourself? Is that truly possible? And maybe Bartók's sense is no. And then he marries his other student. Marta was also, I think he married her when she was 16, and she was his piano student as well.
Oh boy. I want to say something trite, like it was a different time, but that doesn't feel particularly good. And I find it, I do find it stunning that, to me, the most loving romantic music, or the most romantic that Bluebeard sounds, is at the very end, as like the seventh door is open, and it's almost like he's singing finally this loving aria, not just to Judith, but also to the other three wives. It is the most adoring he sounds in the entire opera, right? And she in turn is just sounding more and more broken and just going away. And I don't think we're spoiling anything. I think it feels important to know that the opera does end gloriously silent. There's no calamitous like slamming of the door. Okay, where's the next one? It's almost as if he's tucked them in, and now he goes back to where he might believe he belongs, which is the darkness.
Yeah, it's so fascinating watching this opera. And like, I came to this thought, and then I was reading an article, and that echoed the same thing. I was like, great, I was on perfectly the right track of like how you watch them like start at different parts. So Bartók is completely reserved and like quiet and down, and she is, like she's so steadfast. She's so strong. She's like, I love you. I love you. I want to dry the castle walls with my hair, like, which is the English translation. But like, she's so much up here. And as the opera goes on, they basically just cross. And it is so fascinating, both just watching watching it happen on stage. But if you're just listening to it, like Matt, I'm sure, first did, it's still auditorily, you can tell what is happening. That as, Bluebeard he knows everything at the beginning. He's just, he's devastated. He knows what's behind every single door, and presumably what's happened to every single wife that has, done this before. And so he starts off reserved and sad and, very syllabic, and it's just very quiet. And then about halfway through the opera, they've basically switched. Like, he's like, as the doors are opening, and as he keeps asking her, are you afraid? Are you afraid? And she says no. And so he's like, okay, this is going well. Like, I'm showing off these jagged parts, and she's scared, but she's not like actually truly, she's not shunning me away. And so by the fifth one, he's like, well, look at this beautiful thing. Like, here, the first one is a treasure, or door 3 is a treasure room. Door 4 is the garden. Door 5 is the expanse. And it's like, look at all this beautiful. I can show you all the things that you've gotten past the first 2 scary torture chamber and armory. Like, okay, things are positive. And he's just like, some of my walls have come down, basically. My doors have opened and I'm less afraid. And she is now, as she's discovering the horror, she's getting quieter and quieter. And the music for her is basically just completely switching. There's also some more large scale, like key things, which I think Matt would do a better job talking about, but just in terms of their own vocal lines. And like the Jesse Norman version, I really recommend. It's to watch them. I think they do a really good job of that transition between he is finally like becoming happy, and the end of the opera, he's singing this lullaby basically, and like he's in love with her, but like she's now horrified and is, I guess, just resigned to this fate that she believes, I think, that she has to follow.
Matt, tell us about the key things.
Oh, cool. So one of the things that and this is so Bartókian as well, like it makes me think of music for strings, percussion, and celeste, which has this fantastic arch shape where it starts on A, and as the fugue goes on, the entrances go either above, I put this pencil down, above or below, a fifth above below the A, until you reach the climax, which is an E flat, which is a tritone away, about as far away from the original key as possible. What happens here is it starts in F sharp, and then when you get to that door number 5, it's this brilliant, bright C major. And then at the end, we return to the F sharp, the world of F sharp again, as Judith walks into the 7th door, the castle closes. And then what's even, I think, cooler about this is he doesn't end on the tonic. He ends on the dominant, on C sharp, which I always thought just kind of gives the sense of like we're about to restart this whole thing again, which gives it even a further cyclical view that I thought was just a brilliant touch on. Well, it seems silly for me to tell you Bartók's brilliant. He's a genius. He doesn't need my approval, but it is such a fantastic way to end this piece. I can't help, because of the F sharp and C, also to even think about a little bit of like Stravinsky and Petrushka, the use of those 2 notes, and the way Stravinsky ends it with that that tritone at the end, which gives it an unsettled, uncertain ending as well. So it's really, really fascinating. Again, you can see again how Bartók will get to further levels of technical mastery in his formal constructions in a few decades. It's really, really cool.
I'm so excited for this. I'm especially excited for our cast, for Ryan McKinney and Michelle DeYoung. I've never experienced Ryan before, but his reputation is kind of like this larger than life baritone, which sounds perfect for the internal power that Bluebeard apparently has. But Michelle DeYoung, when she was last here, she just like filled the room. You could just we did Mahler's Das Lied von der Erde with her, and I remember thinking like, this poor woman has to just be on stage and sit and listen for like 20 minutes before she gets to sing her first note. And instead it was watching this masterclass in someone especially like just exuding a presence that did not require movement or noise to be felt. She just was there. and like vibrating with it. And so to see these two come together with these two personalities, I'm just over the moon thrilled to see what they choose to do, because that ultimately will shape this experience as well as what choices are they going to make.
Yeah, I think it's like we, like Serena alluded to, it's, every interpretation is possible. It's all theoretically all happening in the minds of two people, or maybe just one person. Like, any small changes can make you realize something that you didn't before. And I think, these are all very wonderful storied, our conductor, our two singers, like they are wonderful people. And then the symphony, like it's going to be different than what you saw if you saw a Met production or anywhere. It's every single one is going to be different and interesting. And I think that's like, obviously that's like the coolest part about art, is it's all interpretation. But like, especially with a work like this, there's so much room for different ways to tell this story. And I'm doing the super titles, so I'm super excited. I get to watch like all the rehearsals, all the performances, so I will get to see it all, and I'm really, really excited.
Other last thoughts before we wrap it up? This was great, guys.
Another technical thing that can also add to the interpretation, I think there's a technical director or lighting even directors who will also add another layer of how they are seeing it in this kind of semi-staged, which is the most popular way it's performed, simply because of how difficult the Hungarian language is truly to memorize and sing as well. But that doesn't mean that like the intensity is not there, and that there is so much more that can also be added. I love that we have so many people who will collaborate on this final kind of presentation, whether that's through the lighting, some staging, any interaction that the singers have, the way they're singing it, or is it terror, or is it awe that you'll have to come to find out. And I'm looking forward, yes, also to speak with Lydia on her thoughts on that. And we will see at the end of the week how it all turns out.
Matt?
I'm very envious of everyone that gets to be involved in this and get to see this. It is such a remarkable and special piece of music that I wish I myself could actually come see it. So it's one of my favorite operas, and it's like Nicole said, like it's open to a million different interpretations, which makes it all the more remarkable. It really is just a brilliant work.
Well, thank you all very, very much. It is a brilliant work. I'm so excited to put this together and for Omaha to experience this. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.